The temperature on Pluto's surface was currently a balmy 15 degrees Celsius. This was, by all known laws of physics, thermodynamics, and basic cosmic decency, completely impossible. High Administrator Vexith of the Galactic Concordance stared at the readout for the 32nd time that morning, hoping that perhaps his translator was malfunctioning or that he'd accidentally inhaled some of those questionable spores from Deck 19 again. The numbers remained stubbornly, horrifyingly consistent. Pluto, that frozen ball of cosmic irrelevance at the edge of humanity's solar system, had an atmosphere, a breathable one, with weather. "This has to be a sensor malfunction," he said, his three eye stalks converging in what his species considered an expression of extreme skepticism. "Run the diagnostics again." Junior analyst Thremic, who had been the unfortunate soul to first spot the anomaly, made a sound like a deflating accordion. "Hi, Administrator, we've run the diagnostics 38 times. I've personally recalibrated every sensor array within 20 light-years. I've even checked the ones we don't officially admit to having near-human space." He paused, his skin shifting to a pale green that indicated existential distress. "The readings are accurate. Somehow, impossibly, humans have made Pluto habitable." Vexith felt his primary lung constrict. In his 260 years of service to the Concordance, he'd seen some bizarre things. He'd witnessed the Chlorinthians try to weaponize their own stupidity. He'd mediated the great soup wars of Andromeda. He'd even survived a 3-hour presentation from the Department of Unnecessarily Complicated Regulations. But this violated everything he understood about the universe. "How?" he whispered, not really expecting an answer. "The planet is 4.8 billion kilometers from its sun. The ambient temperature should be somewhere around -230 degrees. You can't decide that basic thermodynamics doesn't apply to you." "Apparently," Thremic said with the tone of someone whose sanity had left the building several hours ago, "humans can." But what Vexith didn't know, what no one in the Galactic Concordance could have possibly predicted, was that the entire terraforming of Pluto had started because of an argument about coffee. 3 Earth years earlier, in a research station orbiting Neptune, 2 humans had been having what they considered a perfectly normal conversation. This alone should have been a warning sign to the rest of the galaxy. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, chief planetary physicist and someone who had 3 separate restraining orders from ethics committees, was drinking something that technically qualified as coffee only in the loosest possible sense of the word. Her colleague, Dr. Dmitry Volkov, had just made the fatal mistake of suggesting that proper terraforming of outer solar system bodies was theoretically possible, but practically impossible with current technology. "Impossible?" Yuki had said, slamming her mug down with enough force to send liquid droplets floating in the low gravity. "Dmitry, my friend, you're using that word again, the word that makes humans do incredibly stupid things just to prove it wrong." "I'm just saying," Dmitry replied, pulling up a holographic display of Pluto, "that transforming a frozen dwarf planet into something habitable would require energy outputs we simply don't have access to. We'd need to heat the entire planetary body, create and maintain an atmosphere, establish a stable biosphere, and figure out how to keep it all from just freezing solid again the moment we stopped pumping energy into it. It's a problem of scale." Yuki had gotten that look in her eye, the one that had previously led to the incident with the experimental reactor, the situation with the prototype drive system, and what was now officially referred to in UN Space Command reports as that thing we don't talk about near Jupiter. "Dmitry," she said slowly, "how much energy would we actually need?" What followed was 6 hours of increasingly manic calculations, during which 2 other researchers got involved, then 4, then an engineer who'd wandered in looking for the bathroom and made the mistake of mentioning he'd once written a paper on large-scale thermal regulation systems. By the end of the shift, they had a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane, and quite possibly both. The key insight had come from Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a geothermal specialist who'd been half asleep when she mumbled something about just use the core, obviously. When pressed for clarification, she'd explained, with the patient tone of someone explaining something to very slow children, that Pluto technically had a core. A frozen one, yes, but it was there. And if you could somehow jump-start it, get it spinning and generating heat through good old-fashioned radioactive decay and tidal friction, well, you'd have solved your energy problem. But Pluto doesn't have significant tidal forces, Dmitri had protested. And its core is frozen solid, Yuki had grinned. Doesn't have them yet. The plan they eventually presented to the UN Outer System Development Committee was, by Earth standards, reasonably sensible. By galactic standards, it was the kind of thing that made civilized species develop sudden nervous twitches. They proposed to restart Pluto's core using a series of precisely positioned nuclear charges, then establish a resonance pattern with Charon to create artificial tidal heating, then accelerate the whole system using a network of mass drivers until they achieved the necessary thermal output. Simple. The committee, in a rare moment of something resembling wisdom, had initially rejected the proposal. They'd used words like reckless, insane, and please leave the building immediately. But then somebody made the mistake of saying those fatal words, humans will never be able to terraform a body that far from the sun. It's simply too difficult. It would take resources and coordination beyond anything humanity has ever accomplished. It would be easier to wait until hell freezes over. 6 months later, the Pluto Terraforming Initiative had a budget of 60 billion credits and a staff of 200 enthusiastic volunteers who referred to themselves as the Hell Freezers. Now, back in the present, High Administrator Vexith was learning all of this through the kind of painstaking bureaucratic investigation that the Galactic Concordance did so very well. He'd dispatched a full diplomatic team to Earth's Outer System Command Center, armed with 50,000 pages of questions and a growing sense of cosmic dread. The team was led by Ambassador Quilrix, a Netherian diplomat known for his patience, thoroughness, and ability to maintain composure in even the most bizarre situations. He was going to need all three of those qualities. The meeting room at the OSC station was, Quilrix noted, decorated with what humans apparently considered motivational posters. One showed a photograph of Pluto with the caption, "Said it couldn't be done." Another displayed Earth's sun with the words, "Too far? Hold my beer." A third, most disturbingly, showed a picture of the Galactic Concordance headquarters with the phrase, "Regulations are just suggestions in space." The human liaison officer, Commander Robert Kowalski, entered with the kind of casual confidence that made Quilrix's second stomach clench nervously. "Ambassador, welcome to the OSC. I understand you have some questions about our Pluto operations?" "Questions," Quilrix said carefully, "is perhaps too mild a term. We have concerns, very significant concerns. You appear to have terraformed a dwarf planet that should, by all rights, be a frozen wasteland. We'd like to know how, why, and perhaps most importantly, whether you filed the proper environmental impact assessments." Kowalski blinked. "Environmental impact? Ambassador, it's Pluto. The environment was impact. Literally, that's how it was formed." "Nevertheless," Quilrix pressed on, "there are protocols, regulations, treaties specifically governing the modification of celestial bodies. The Concordance takes these matters very seriously." "Oh, right," Kowalski said, tapping on a datapad. "I'm pulling up our documentation now. Let's see, we filed Form TF-319 for preliminary geological surveys, Form ATM-81 for atmospheric generation, and... oh, here we go, the big one, Form Planet Mod-whatever, General Celestial Body Modification Intent." Quilrix felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps the humans had followed proper procedures. Perhaps this was all just a misunderstanding. "And when did you file these forms?" "Oh, about 6 months ago, right around the time we started seeing breathable atmosphere readings." "What?" Quilrix's vocal sacs inflated with alarm. "You filed the paperwork after you'd already completed the terraforming?" "Well, yes," Kowalski said, looking confused. "We had to make sure the project actually worked before we filed all the forms. Otherwise, we'd be wasting everyone's time with paperwork for a failed experiment." "We're not monsters, Ambassador." Quilrix made a mental note to add this entire conversation to his personal therapy file. "Commander, could you please explain in detail how you managed to heat an entire planet that receives less than 1% of Earth's solar radiation?" "Oh, that!" Kowalski brightened considerably. "That's actually the clever bit. You want the technical explanation or the simple version?" "Let's start with simple," Quilrix said, dreading what was coming. "We turned it on." There was a long silence. Quilrix's translator made a small clicking sound, as if it too was struggling to process what it had just heard. "I'm sorry, you turned it on?" "The core, yes. Well, technically we restarted it. Pluto had a molten core about 3 billion years ago before it cooled down. We just got it going again. You restarted a planetary core. A core that has been frozen for 3 billion years, give or take," Kowalski agreed cheerfully. The actual process was pretty straightforward. We dropped a series of modified fusion devices into the deepest crevasses we could find, synchronized the detonation sequence to create resonant pressure waves, and basically gave the whole planet's interior a really good whack, like hitting a stuck engine until it starts working again. Quilrix was now experiencing what he would later describe in his report as a temporary disconnect between my conscious mind and my will to live. Through sheer professional discipline, he managed to ask, "And the atmosphere?" "Oh, that was Dr. Tanaka's doing. Brilliant woman, bit scary when she gets excited. See, once we had the core generating heat, the surface ice started sublimating. That gave us water vapor, which was great but not breathable, so we needed to introduce other gases. The initial plan was to import them from the outer gas giants, but that turned out to be too expensive, and someone pointed out it might upset the orbital dynamics of Neptune." "How thoughtful," Quilrix said weakly. "Right? Anyway, Dr. Okonkwo suggested we just manufacture the gases locally. Pluto has tons of nitrogen ice, methane ice, carbon dioxide ice, all the building blocks. We set up a series of atmospheric processing plants around the equator, each one basically a giant chemistry lab that takes in frozen compounds and outputs breathable atmosphere. We've got 23 of them running continuously, and they're almost keeping up with the heat loss to space. Almost. Well, the planet still cools down a bit. That's why we've got the orbital mirrors. Quilrix hadn't thought his day could get worse. He was wrong. Orbital mirrors? Kowalski pulled up a holographic display showing Pluto surrounded by a ring of massive reflective satellites, 78 of them positioned to capture and redirect sunlight onto the surface. They're not very efficient given the distance from the sun, but every little bit helps. Plus, they look really cool during sunset. We get these amazing rainbow effects through the atmosphere. "Commander," Quilrix said, his voice climbing into registers usually reserved for emergency evacuations, "do you understand that what you're describing represents a level of planetary engineering that most species don't achieve until they've been spacefaring for thousands of years? Humans have been in space for barely 2 centuries. Has it been that long already?" Kowalski mused. "Feels like just yesterday. We were arguing about whether that thing on the moon landing was a flag or a studio prop. Time flies when you're terraforming, I suppose." Quilrix decided he needed to see this nightmare in person. "Commander, I'm formally requesting permission to visit the Pluto colony." "Colony?" Kowalski looked surprised. "Oh, we don't call it a colony. That sounds too temporary. It's the Pluto settlement. Population currently stands at about 8,000 permanent residents, mostly researchers and support staff. Though I should warn you, tourist season just started, so it might be a bit crowded." "Tourist season." Quilrix repeated the words carefully, hoping they might make more sense the second time. They didn't. "People are vacationing on Pluto?" "Well, sure. Where else are you going to go ice climbing on a dwarf planet? Plus the low gravity makes for some fantastic skiing. And the cocktail bars in New Reykjavik are supposed to be amazing. Everything's served in ice glasses that don't melt, because, you know, Pluto. 3 days later, Quilrix found himself aboard a human transport ship, trying very hard not to think about the fact that he was voluntarily traveling to a planet that, until very recently, had been one of the most inhospitable places in the solar system. His aide, a young Vrelian named Styx, seemed far too excited about the whole thing. "I've read all about the Pluto settlement," Styx burbled enthusiastically. "Apparently, they've established a complete ecosystem. Trees, grass, even small animals. On a planet that gets less sunlight than a cave system," Quilrix muttered. "Yes, I'm sure the trees are thriving." As it turned out, they were. The shuttle descent through Pluto's new atmosphere gave Quilrix a view he would never forget, though he desperately wanted to. The surface below was a patchwork of different environments. There were forests, clearly visible even from altitude, clustered around massive transparent domes that caught and amplified the weak sunlight. Between them, ice plains sparkled like diamonds, crisscrossed with what appeared to be roads, and there, near the Terminator line, was New Reykjavik itself, a sprawling settlement of interconnected habitats that glowed with internal lighting. The shuttle pilot, a cheerful woman named Lieutenant Reeves, provided running commentary. "That dark patch to the east is the experimental wheat fields. Not doing great, honestly, but Dr. Singh thinks she's got a new strain that might work better. The lake you can see near the mountains is Lake Tombor, named after the guy who discovered Pluto back in the day. It's artificially heated, obviously, but people actually swim in it. There's a diving club and everything." "Of course there is," Quilrix said faintly. They landed at what Reeves called the main hub, a structure that looked like someone had crossbred a space station with a shopping mall and then decided to add a greenhouse on top just for fun. As Quilrix descended the shuttle ramp, he took his first breath of Pluto's atmosphere. It smelled like pine trees and ozone, with a faint metallic tang that he suspected came from the atmospheric processes. The temperature was cool but not uncomfortable, and the gravity, while low, was manageable with the assistance device he'd been given. Waiting to greet him was Dr. Yuki Tanaka herself, looking far too pleased with the situation. "Ambassador Quilrix, welcome to Pluto. I'm Dr. Tanaka, chief architect of this particular miracle/disaster, depending on who you ask." "I suspect," Quilrix said carefully, "that the Galactic Concordance will have strong opinions on which category this falls into." "Oh, I'm counting on it," Yuki said with a grin that made Quilrix's survival instinct scream warnings. "Nothing makes better publicity than bureaucratic disapproval. Our tourism applications went up 30% after your office sent that official notice of concern. Come on, let me show you around." The tour that followed was simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. Yuki walked him through the atmospheric processing facilities, where massive machines extracted gases from Pluto's ice and transformed them into breathable air. She showed him the thermal regulation network, a series of underground pipes that circulated heat from the core to the surface. She introduced him to colonists who were somehow thriving in this impossible environment, including a family with 3 children who'd been born on Pluto and considered Earth too heavy and boring. But the real shock came when they visited the Biosphere Center, a massive dome containing what Yuki proudly described as a complete working ecosystem, more or less. "More or less?" Quilrix asked weakly, staring at what appeared to be a forest of earth trees growing in Plutonian soil. "Well, we've had to make some adjustments," Yuki admitted. "The trees are genetically modified to work with the low light levels. We've got artificial UV lamps on a day-night cycle. The soil is technically a hybrid of Plutonian regolith and Earth topsoil, mixed with about 60 different bacterial cultures. And we've introduced a very carefully curated selection of insects, small mammals, and birds." "Birds," Quilrix repeated. "You brought birds to Pluto." "Just finches, mostly." Oh, and some penguins. Penguins? Look, it's an ice planet, okay? Someone made a joke about penguins, and then Dr. Volkov said he could actually make it work. And before we knew it, we had 50 penguins in cold-adapted habitats. They're doing surprisingly well. The low gravity actually helps them move around on land. You should see them jump. It's hilarious. Quilrix watched a small brown bird flutter past, defying everything he knew about planetary biology, ecology, and common sense. Dr. Tanaka, he said slowly, why penguins? Of all the things you could have brought to this planet, why penguins? Yuki shrugged. Why not penguins? We had the space in the transport. They're well adapted to cold environments. And honestly, after you've successfully terraformed a dwarf planet, adding penguins barely registers on the scale of weird decisions. Plus, they're cute. That counts for a lot. This entire settlement, Quilrix said, operates on a logic that I cannot begin to comprehend. Welcome to humanity, Yuki replied cheerfully. Coffee? The coffee shop, because of course there was a coffee shop, was called The Last Stop Cafe and occupied a prime location with windows overlooking the ice plains beyond New Reykjavik. Quilrix found himself sitting in a chair made from some kind of compressed plutonian mineral, drinking something Yuki promised was coffee but tasted more like burnt ambition with a hint of vanilla, and trying to formulate the questions that would somehow explain all of this to the Galactic Concordance. Dr. Tanaka, he began, I need to understand the decision-making process that led to this project. Someone, somewhere, had to approve this. There must have been planning meetings, budget reviews, risk assessments. How did you convince Earth's government that terraforming Pluto was a reasonable idea? Yuki took a long sip of her coffee. Well, Ambassador, that's a fascinating story. See, we didn't exactly convince them it was reasonable. We convinced them it was possible. There's a difference. I'm not sure I follow. Humans have this quirk, Yuki explained, warming to her subject. If you tell us something is impossible, we get irritated. If you tell us something is impractical, we get creative. But if you tell us something is both impossible and impractical, and then you imply we're not smart enough to do it anyway, well, that's when things get interesting. So this entire project, Quilrix said slowly, was motivated by spite? Passionate spite, Yuki corrected. There's a difference. Regular spite makes you do small petty things. Passionate spite makes you terraform dwarf planets just to prove a point. The UN committee that approved our funding didn't think we'd actually succeed. They figured we'd run some experiments, collect some data, maybe establish a small research outpost, and quietly give up when the technical challenges became too great. But you didn't give up. Are you kidding? Once we realized people were betting against us, we couldn't give up. Do you know how many scientific papers were published saying our approach wouldn't work? How many so-called experts called us reckless, irresponsible dreamers? We had to prove them wrong. It became a matter of professional pride. Quilrix was beginning to understand, and the understanding was deeply troubling. So the entire terraforming of Pluto was essentially an elaborate exercise in proving your critics wrong. Well, not entirely, Yuki said. We also wanted to advance planetary science, establish humanity's first true outer system settlement, and demonstrate that with enough determination and questionable decision-making, humans can thrive anywhere in the solar system. But yes, spite was a significant motivating factor. This, Quilrix said, is going to be very difficult to explain to the Concordance. I imagine so, Yuki agreed. Especially since we're already getting requests from Earth about expanding the project. Quilrix's primary circulatory organ skipped several beats. Expanding? How could you possibly expand beyond terraforming an entire planet? Well, Yuki said, pulling up a holographic display. Some people have been pointing out that Pluto isn't technically the most distant object in the solar system anymore. We've got several trans-Neptunian objects that are bigger, farther out, and completely untouched by human engineering. Someone calculated that with our current technology and the lessons learned from Pluto, we could potentially terraform one of them in half the time. Please, Quilrick said desperately, please tell me you're joking. I wish I was, Yuki sighed. But Dr. Volkov has already submitted a preliminary proposal for what he's calling Project Even Further Out. The working title is terrible, but the science is actually solid. We could do it, Ambassador. We could terraform objects so far from the sun that they're barely in its gravitational influence. We could build settlements in places that make Pluto look cozy and welcoming. But why? Quilrix practically shouted, drawing looks from other cafe patrons. Why would you want to? Yuki smiled. Because it's there, because people said we couldn't. Because every time humans accomplish something impossible, the definition of impossible has to be rewritten. And honestly, because it's kind of fun to watch the galaxy's bureaucrats try to process what we've done. Quilrick spent the next 2 days conducting interviews, reviewing technical documentation, and slowly coming to terms with the reality of what humanity had achieved. He spoke with Dr. Dmitry Volkov, who explained the core reactivation process with such casual disregard for conventional physics that Quilrix developed a minor nervous condition. He met with Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, whose approach to geothermal engineering could best be described as controlled chaos with excellent documentation. He even attended a presentation by the settlement's chief administrator, a man named Leonard Fisher, who seemed perpetually surprised that anything worked at all. Honestly, Fisher told him over lunch in the observation deck, I wake up every morning half expecting the whole thing to have catastrophically failed overnight, but it keeps working. The atmosphere stays stable, the temperature regulation holds, the ecosystems thrive. It's like we've accidentally created something that actually makes sense, despite doing everything wrong according to conventional wisdom. According to galactic wisdom, Quilrix corrected gently. Right, that too. Look, Ambassador, I get that this whole thing seems insane from your perspective. It seems pretty insane from our perspective too, and we're the ones living here. But here's the thing about humans. We don't really understand the word impossible the way you do. For us, impossible just means hasn't been done yet. That attitude, Quilrix observed, is going to cause significant problems as humanity expands into the galaxy. Probably, Fisher agreed cheerfully, but it's also going to lead to some amazing discoveries. We're already seeing effects from the Pluto project that we didn't anticipate. This caught Quilrix's attention. Effects? What kind of effects? Fisher looked uncomfortable. Well, this is actually something we've been meaning to report to the Concordance, but we've been trying to figure out how to phrase it diplomatically. The thing is, when we restarted Pluto's core and established the thermal regulation system, we kind of affected Neptune. The temperature in the observation deck suddenly seemed several degrees colder. Affected Neptune how? See, we knew that increasing Pluto's mass through atmospheric generation and the addition of orbital mirrors would have some gravitational effects on the rest of the system. We calculated all of that. What we didn't fully account for was the way the thermal output from Pluto would interact with Neptune's magnetosphere during close approaches in their orbital cycles. What, Quilrix said with forced calm, is happening to Neptune? Nothing bad, Fisher said quickly. Probably. It's just that Neptune's upper atmosphere has been showing some unusual temperature fluctuations. Very minor, nothing that would affect the planet's overall stability, but definitely measurable. And there's been some increased storm activity in the northern hemisphere. You've affected the weather on another planet. Accidentally, Fisher emphasized, and only a little bit. The good news is that we're monitoring it very carefully, and we've got plans to compensate if the effects get worse. Dr. Tanaka thinks we can install some dampening satellites that would absorb the excess energy, and Dr. Volkov has a theoretical model for adjusting Pluto's orbital position to minimize the interaction. Quilrix had reached his limit. Mr. Fisher, I need to file my report to the Concordance. I need to return to my ship, process everything I've seen, and somehow explain to the most powerful governing body in the galaxy that humans have not only terraformed one planet, but are now accidentally modifying another one. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like me to include? Fisher thought for a moment. Tell them we're sorry about Neptune and that we're working on it. Oh, and maybe mention that we've learned a lot from this experience and we promise to be more careful with our next terraforming project. Next project? Well, yeah. I mean, we can't just stop now. We've got the technology, we've got the expertise, and we've got a whole solar system full of planets and moons that could use some atmosphere. Mars is the obvious next target. But some people are talking about Venus, and there's a whole faction that wants to try terraforming Europa, even though that would involve melting the ice shell without killing whatever might be living in the ocean underneath, which seems tricky but potentially doable. Quilrix left Pluto the next morning, his mind full of statistics, technical explanations, and the creeping certainty that humanity was going to reshape the entire galaxy, whether the galaxy wanted it or not. His report to the Galactic Concordance ran to 300 pages and included 57 appendices, 2 nervous breakdowns captured on audio recording, and a formal request for hazard pay. The Concordance's response arrived 6 weeks later. High Administrator Vexith, looking like he'd aged 30 years since their last communication, delivered the verdict via secure channel. Ambassador Quilrix, the Concordance has reviewed your report on the human terraforming of Pluto. After extensive debate, consultation with our finest scientific minds, and what I'm told was a rather heated argument in the council chamber that resulted in property damage, we've reached a decision. Quilrix waited, his entire diplomatic career flashing before his eyes. We are officially classifying humanity as a Category 7 uncontrolled variable. This is a new category we just created specifically for species who terraform planets out of spite. You are to inform Earth's government that while we cannot technically stop them from modifying their own solar system, we are strongly requesting that they at least try to fill out the paperwork before starting their next project. Also, please ask them to stop affecting Neptune. That's making several of our astrophysicists cry. Is that all, High Administrator? Vexith's eye stalks drooped with exhaustion. No. We're also formally inviting humanity to join the Concordance's Planetary Engineering Committee. Apparently, despite doing everything wrong, they've achieved results that our best engineers said would take centuries to accomplish. The committee wants to know how. They're either going to learn something valuable or have collective mental breakdowns. Possibly both. Understood, High Administrator. One more thing, Ambassador. Personal question, how are the penguins? Quilrix blinked. I'm sorry? The penguins, on Pluto, how are they doing? They're fine, sir, thriving, actually. The low gravity seems to agree with them. Vexith made a sound that might have been laughter or crying. Of course it does. Of course the penguins are fine. Why wouldn't they be? Humans terraformed a dwarf planet, and the penguins are fine. He paused. Ambassador, I'm taking a vacation. I'm going to a planet with normal physics and reasonable inhabitants who don't casually violate thermodynamics. I'll be back in 3 months. Try not to let the humans terraform anything major while I'm gone. The communication ended, leaving Quilrix alone with his thoughts and the growing suspicion that his career was about to get much more interesting. Back on Pluto, Dr. Yuki Tanaka was having coffee with Dr. Dmitry Volkov in their favorite cafe, watching the artificial sunset paint the ice plains in shades of orange and pink. The orbital mirrors were catching the light just right, creating those rainbow effects that the tourists loved so much. So, Dmitry said casually, I've been running some calculations on Europa. Don't, Yuki said immediately. Don't even start. I'm just saying that if we could find a way to heat the subsurface ocean without disrupting whatever ecosystem might be down there, we'd have access to more liquid water than all of Earth's oceans combined. Do you know what we could do with that much water in the outer system? Create problems, Yuki said flatly. That's what we'd do. We'd create enormous galaxy-spanning problems that would make the Neptune situation look like a rounding error. But interesting problems. Yuki sighed, staring at her coffee. How long would it take? If we started now, maybe 5 years for the preliminary surveys, another 3 for the heat distribution network, and then 2 years for the actual melting process. Call it a decade, total. A decade to give Jupiter a habitable moon. Technically, it would be a habitable ocean under a moon, but yes. They sat in silence for a moment, watching tourists glide past on low-gravity skis, watching colonists tend to impossible gardens, watching their success spread across the surface of a planet that everyone said would remain frozen forever. We'd need approval from at least 6 different committees, Yuki said finally. Probably more like 8, with the new concordance oversight requirements. And we'd have to be extremely careful not to damage any existing life forms. Obviously, we're not monsters, Yuki, and we'd need to figure out the Neptune situation first. Well, yes. Finish one project before starting another. That's just good time management. Another long pause. I'll start drafting the proposal, Yuki said. Dmitri grinned. I've already got the preliminary calculations done. We could have something ready for review in 2 weeks. You're terrible. You're the one who agreed to draft the proposal. They clinked their coffee mugs together. 2 humans sitting on an impossible planet, already planning their next impossible project. In his office on Pluto's administration level, Leonard Fisher was reading the official communication from the Galactic Concordance when his assistant Maya Park poked her head through the door. Sir, there's a delegation from the tourism board here to see you. Something about adding Pluto to the 100 wonders of the local cluster list? Fisher laughed, a sound that held equal parts disbelief and resignation. Send them in, and Maya, start putting together a task force for managing increased tourist traffic. I have a feeling things are about to get much busier. Busier than terraforming a dwarf planet? Different kind of busy. The kind where people show up expecting cocktails and skiing instead of impossible physics and spite-driven engineering. So, easier? Honestly? Probably not. 3,000 kilometers above the surface, in the network of orbital mirrors that kept Pluto warm and habitable, a maintenance crew was conducting routine inspections. Chief Engineer Sarah Chen was explaining something to her trainee, a young man named Kyle who'd arrived from Earth 2 months ago and was still adjusting to the sheer insanity of daily life on humanity's most impossible colony. So let me get this straight, Kyle said, his voice crackling over the suitcom. These mirrors collect sunlight that's almost 4 billion kilometers old, bounce it down to a planet that was frozen solid 3 years ago, and help maintain an atmosphere that shouldn't exist on a world with this little gravity? That's the basic idea, yes, Sarah confirmed, checking the alignment on Mirror 33. Though it's a bit more complicated than that. We're also using them to focus energy on specific areas during the artificial winter cycle, and during tourist season, we angle them to create those light shows everyone loves. This is completely insane. Welcome to Pluto, kid. Check your sanity at the door, because physics doesn't live here anymore. Kyle laughed, then stopped abruptly. Chief, I'm getting some weird readings from the Mirror 41 sector. Sarah jetted over to his position, pulling up the diagnostic display on her helmet. Huh, that is weird. Looks like there's some kind of... What the hell? Chief, get Dr. Tanaka on the line right now. 20 minutes later, Yuki was reviewing the data while Dmitri looked over her shoulder, both of them having abandoned their coffee and Europa plans for something potentially more urgent. It's definitely an anomaly, Yuki muttered, scrolling through the readings. The mirror's showing energy outputs about 3% higher than it should be. That shouldn't be possible unless it's collecting light from another source. But there's nothing else out here, just Pluto, Charon, and empty space. Unless, Dmitri said slowly, the mirrors are picking up thermal radiation from Pluto itself. We knew the core reactivation would create some secondary effects, but if the planet is radiating enough heat to be reflected by the mirrors, that changes our thermal balance calculations significantly. Yuki pulled up a planetary model, running quick calculations. If we're creating a feedback loop where the mirrors reflect Pluto's own heat back onto the surface, we might be able to reduce our energy input from the atmospheric processes. That would save us about 20% on operating costs. Or, Dmitri said darkly, it means we're accidentally creating a runaway greenhouse effect that will turn Pluto into a steam bath in 50 years. They looked at each other. Run the long-term models, Yuki said. All of them. And get Patricia on this too. If we're changing the fundamental thermal dynamics of the planet, we need to know now. Should we inform the concordance? Let's figure out if it's a problem first. If it's not a problem, we just send them a nice data update about improved efficiency. If it is a problem, we send them a nice data update about how we're already fixing it. That's not exactly transparent communication. Dmitri, we just got classified as a Category 7 uncontrolled variable. I don't think the concordance expects transparent communication from us anymore. I think they expect damage control and pleasant surprises. Dmitri couldn't argue with that logic. The analysis took 3 days and involved virtually every scientist on Pluto. What they discovered was simultaneously reassuring and concerning, which seemed to be the standard outcome for anything involving the Pluto settlement. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo presented the findings to the leadership team, which now included Ambassador Quilrix, who decided to stay on Pluto as a permanent liaison to the concordance. He'd cited professional duty as his reason, but everyone suspected he'd simply given up trying to explain Pluto from a distance and figured he might as well watch the chaos unfold up close. The good news, Patricia began, is that we're not creating a runaway greenhouse effect. The thermal feedback we're seeing is well within manageable parameters and actually gives us more stability in the long term. We can reduce energy input from the atmospheric processes by 18%, which means lower operational costs and less strain on the system. And the bad news? Fisher asked. The bad news is that we're radiating enough heat into space that we're creating measurable effects in the surrounding cosmic environment. Nothing dramatic, but Neptune isn't the only thing we're affecting. We're also warming up the Kuiper belt. Everyone stared at her. How much of the Kuiper belt? Yuki asked carefully. Most of it. The thermal radiation from Pluto is spreading out in a sphere, obviously, and while it dissipates quickly, there are thousands of small objects in the belt that are now experiencing temperatures about 0.3 degrees higher than they should be. 0.3 degrees, Quilrix said. That's actually not catastrophic? No, it's really not, Patricia agreed. It's barely measurable. But it is happening, and it means that humanity has technically affected an entire region of space. We've warmed the Kuiper belt. We're the reason that thousands of comets and asteroids are slightly less cold than they were 4 years ago. There was a long silence. I'll add it to the report, Quilrix said wearily, under the section titled Additional Unintended Consequences That Seem Minor but Might Be Important Later. We should probably try to do something about it, Fisher said without much conviction. Like what? Yuki asked. Put heat shields around the entire planet. That would defeat the purpose of having a habitable surface. This is just what happens when you terraform something. You affect the surrounding environment. It's basic physics. Physics that the concordance has very detailed regulations about, Quilrix reminded her. Then the concordance needs to update their regulations to account for species who terraform dwarf planets. Yuki shot back. We can't be held responsible for rules that were written assuming no one would ever actually do this. That, Quilrix said, is a surprisingly valid legal argument. I hate it, but it's valid. The meeting concluded with a plan to install additional monitoring equipment throughout the Kuiper belt, which would at least let them track the effects more precisely. It was, everyone agreed, the responsible thing to do, even if they had no idea what they'd actually do with the information once they had it. That night, In the bar at the Last Stop Cafe, which had expanded to include a proper pub section with local Plutonian ice beer on tap, a group of colonists were celebrating the settlement's 4th anniversary. The mood was festive, the gravity was low, and the conversations were the kind that only happened when humans gathered in impossible places. "You know what I love about this place," said Marcus Wong, a hydroponics engineer who'd been on Pluto since the first month of habitation. "Everyone said we were crazy, everyone, and they were right. We were crazy, but we did it anyway, and now we're living on a terraformed dwarf planet drinking beer made from water we melted from ancient ice while tourists take selfies with penguins. How is that not the most human thing ever?" "The most human thing ever," corrected his friend Julia Santos, a structural engineer who'd designed half the settlement's pressure domes, "would be if we accidentally destroyed Neptune while trying to fix the problem we caused by being here. That's peak humanity right there." "We're not going to destroy Neptune," said Chen, the mirror maintenance chief who joined them after finishing her shift. "Worst case, we make its storms a bit more intense. Best case, we figure out how to stabilize it and end up improving Neptune's climate in the process." "Improving Neptune's climate," Julia repeated. "Neptune's climate, the gas giant that's been doing just fine for 4.5 billion years. We're going to improve it. When you say it like that, it sounds arrogant. Chen, we terraformed Pluto. Arrogant is our default setting now." The laughter that followed was genuine and warm, the kind of sound that came from people who'd accomplished something impossible together and were still processing what it meant. In his corner booth, Ambassador Quilrix listened to the conversation and found himself smiling despite everything. He'd been sending regular reports to the Concordance, documenting every aspect of life on Pluto, and slowly his perspective had shifted. What had initially seemed like chaos and recklessness now looked more like determination and creativity. The humans weren't ignoring physics, they were just refusing to accept the usual limitations. His datapad chimed with a message from High Administrator Vexith. "Ambassador, the Council has reviewed your latest reports and made a decision regarding humanity's petition to join the Concordance's Planetary Engineering Committee. We're accepting their application, with the caveat that they have to promise to at least try to follow standard procedures. Also, we're assigning you as humanity's permanent liaison to the committee. Congratulations on your promotion. Try not to let them terraform anything too important." Quilrix read the message twice, then set down his datapad and ordered another drink. It was going to be a long career. Across the settlement, in her small apartment with its view of the ice plains and the artificial aurora that danced in Pluto's night sky, Yuki Tanaka was reviewing the final calculations for the Europa proposal. Dmitri had been right. The preliminary work would only take 2 weeks. They'd already identified the optimal locations for the thermal injection points, calculated the energy requirements, and drafted a communication strategy that would hopefully convince the Concordance that melting Jupiter's moon from the inside was a reasonable next step for humanity. Her communicator buzzed. It was a message from Commander Kowalski at the Outer System Command Center. "Dr. Tanaka, I've got news. The UN committee just approved preliminary funding for Project Europa. They're calling it a logical extension of the Pluto program and a chance to demonstrate humanity's commitment to responsible planetary engineering. Also, between you and me, I think they just want to see if you can actually pull it off. Budget approval coming through in 6 months. Thought you'd want to know." Yuki sat back in her chair, staring at the message, feeling the weight of what was coming. Europa, a whole ocean world waiting to be transformed. New challenges, new problems, new impossibilities to make possible. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt excited. Her communicator buzzed again. This time it was Dmitri. "Did you see the news? We're actually doing this. We're going to melt Europa." "Looks like it," Yuki typed back. "You ready for another impossible project?" "Are you kidding? This is what we do. Impossible is just another word for not done yet. You know the concordance is going to have opinions about this. Let them have opinions. We're going to have a habitable ocean moon. Yuki looked out her window at the settlement below, at the lights shining in Pluto's twilight, at the evidence of what humans could accomplish when they decided that impossible was negotiable. Somewhere out there, past Neptune's orbit, Europa waited. Another frozen world, another impossible challenge, another chance to prove that humans didn't understand the meaning of the word no. She pulled up the Europa proposal and started adding notes, already thinking about thermal distribution patterns, ecosystem preservation strategies, and how many penguins would be appropriate for a subsurface ocean. Probably not many, but maybe a few, for tradition. Outside, Pluto's artificial night continued, the temperature holding steady at a comfortable 12 degrees. The atmosphere processing plants humming along, and the orbital mirrors catching starlight to splash across the impossible world humans had built. Tourists took photos, colonists worked their shifts, penguins jumped in low gravity. And somewhere in the depths of the planet, the reactivated core continued its steady rotation, generating heat that would keep Pluto warm and habitable for centuries to come. The galactic concordance would eventually come to terms with humanity's achievement. They'd write new regulations, create new oversight committees, and establish protocols for dealing with species who terraformed planets because someone said they couldn't. They'd classify the Pluto settlement as one of the modern wonders of the galaxy, a testament to determination and stubborn refusal to accept limitations. But they'd never quite understand why humans did it. Why take on such monumental challenges for no reason beyond proving it was possible? Why risk so much for settlements on frozen worlds at the edge of the solar system? The answer, as Yuki could have told them, was simple. Humans had spent their entire evolutionary history looking at impossible barriers and treating them as suggestions. Mountains that couldn't be climbed, oceans that couldn't be crossed, skies that couldn't be flown through. And every single time, some human looked at the impossible thing and said, "Watch me." Pluto had just been another in a long line of impossible things that turned out to be possible after all. And Europa would be next. And after that, who knew? Maybe they'd find a way to terraform Venus despite its crushing atmosphere and runaway greenhouse effect. Maybe they'd build rotating habitats in interstellar space. Maybe they'd figure out how to make life thrive in the most hostile environments the universe had to offer. Because that's what humans did. They looked at the universe's rules and decided which ones they wanted to follow. On Earth, in the UN Outer System Development Committee's headquarters, a new proposal was making its way through the bureaucratic pipeline. It was titled Project Titan, Atmospheric Enhancement and Surface Warming of Saturn's Largest Moon. The committee members who read it developed headaches and reached for their stress medication. Someone pointed out that Titan already had an atmosphere, which should have made the project easier. The fact that this comment was meant to be reassuring told them everything they needed to know about where humanity was heading. In his office above the ice plains of Pluto, Leonard Fisher watched the sunset through his window and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They'd done it. Against all odds, against conventional wisdom, against the explicit doubts of virtually every expert in the galaxy, they'd turned a frozen rock into a living world. And it worked. It was stable. It was sustainable. It was thriving. His communicator chimed with a message from the UN, asking him to start compiling best practices and lessons learned from the Pluto project to be shared with future terraforming efforts. There was also a request for him to join the planning committee for Project Europa, offering his expertise in managing impossible settlements. He accepted both requests, then added a note suggesting they might want to invest in better therapy services for their administrators. Managing humanity's expansion into space was going to require a lot of people who could handle stress. Down in the Biosphere Center, a group of school children from Earth were taking a tour, their eyes wide with wonder, as they looked at trees growing on Pluto. Their teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was explaining how the atmospheric processes worked, how the orbital mirrors functioned, how the core reactivation had made all of this possible. But how did they know it would work? One child asked. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. They didn't. They just believed it would, and they tried anyway. That's what humans do, honey. We try impossible things, and sometimes they work out. What happens when they don't work out? We try again, differently. It was, Quilrix reflected from his position at the back of the tour group, the most honest explanation of human space exploration he'd heard yet. As Pluto rotated toward its long night, the settlement's lights grew brighter, artificial suns driving back the darkness. In cafes and bars, in research labs and living quarters, in the greenhouses and ice plains and low-gravity recreation areas, 8,000 humans went about their lives on a world that everyone agreed should have remained frozen forever. And 30 astronomical units away, on a blue-green marble orbiting a yellow sun, 7 billion more humans looked at the stars and wondered what impossible thing their species would attempt next. The answer, as it always was with humans, was simple. Whatever they wanted.